Hello, Eagle Algebra students. Today, the lesson is on multiplying polynomials. When we multiply polynomials, we use a concept that you're already pretty familiar with it, and that is the distributive property. So, at the beginning of the year, we simplified expressions where we had something like A times the quantity B plus C, where, you go ahead and, distribute. Well, multiplying polynomials is pretty much the same exact thing. A couple of things you have to understand. One, keep track of your signs. Know whether you're multiplying positives or negatives. And two is when you multiply any exponents or any variable expressions, when you multiply them, you basically go ahead and you add the exponents. Okay, and that's a common mistake students make. Okay, and we just learned that last chapter. So in this first one, here we have a monomial times a trinomial. Okay, and when we multiply these together, all we are using is the distributive property. So just basically multiply the coefficients, multiply the variable expressions by adding the exponents. So 6 times 2 is 12. X to the third times x squared would be x to the 3 plus 2, which is 5. And 6 times negative 2 is negative 12. X to the third times x is x to the fourth. And 6 times 3 is 18. X to the third. Okay, that's a monomial times a trinomial. Anytime you multiply any polynomial by a monomial, all you are doing is basically distributing. And this is what we get. Now here we have a binomial times a binomial. Now we're going to do one of these using, a method I like to use, which is just showing your distributions. The other way will show what we call FOIL. Okay. Now the way I like to do it is I like to take each term in the first binomial. So in this case it's 6x, and multiply it by each term in the second. So we are basically pulling out the first term, distributing it, pulling out the second term, and distributing it to the same binomial. Once we go ahead and distribute 6x times 3x, remember 6 times 3 is 18, x times x is x squared, then 6x times negative 2 is negative 12x, then 3 times 3x is 9x, 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, and when we combine like terms in the middle, we end up with 8x squared, or 18x squared, then negative 12 plus 9 is minus 3x, then you have your minus 6. So I like to pull each term out and distribute. Now some teachers will teach what they call FOIL, which is the first plus the outer plus the inner plus the last, which means if you take the first terms, okay, and you multiply them together, 2x times 5x will give you 10x squared. Then your outers, okay, your two outer terms, which in this case are 2x and negative 2. When you multiply those, you get negative 4x. And you have your inner terms, which are these two terms. And negative 5 times 5x will give you negative 25x. And then your last terms would be the last term in each binomial. So the last one here is 5, the last one here is negative 2, and that would give you negative 10, so we would go ahead and subtract that term. Once you show all your distributions, you basically go ahead and combine like terms. You only have one x squared term, then negative 4x minus 25x is negative 29x, and then bring down the minus 10. So this is two different methods that you can use to multiply a binomial times a binomial. Okay? Now down below, it's a little different because here what we have is a trinomial. You have a trinomial, and then here you have a binomial. Okay? Now when we have a trinomial times a binomial, it's basically now how many times do you have to distribute, from this trinomial to this binomial. If you have 3 terms, you have to distribute 3 terms to this binomial. So we take the first term out, 3x squared distributed to the 7x minus 1. Then next we pull out the 5x, or sorry, the negative 5x. Okay, so we pull out the negative 5x, and we distribute it to the 7x minus 1. And then we pull out the last term, which is 2, and distribute to 7x minus 1. So basically we'll now go through all of these distributions. So 3x squared times 7x gives you 21x to the third. 3x squared times negative 1 is minus 3x squared. Negative 5x times 7x gives you minus 35x squared. Negative 5x times negative 1 is plus 5x. 2 times 7x is 14x. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And now all you do is combine like terms. So 21x to the third, and combine negative 3x squared minus 35x squared gives you minus 38x squared. Then 5x plus 14x gives you 19x. Bring down your final negative 2, and after you combine like terms, you end up with this polynomial. So the key is to know, if you're multiplying polynomials, the number of terms in your first polynomial tells you the number of distributions you have to, make to the second binomial or second polynomial. So let's look at the next one. Here we have a binomial times a trinomial. Well, if I look at two terms in this polynomial, so how many distributions am I going to have to do? 2. So we pull out the first x, and we know we're going to distribute it to the second polynomial. 4x squared minus 8x plus 3. And then I have my second term, which is negative 2, and I'm going to distribute it to the 4x squared minus 8x plus 3. Once I distribute here, you get 4x to the third minus 8x squared plus the 3x, and here negative 8x squared plus 16x minus 6. And when you go ahead and combine like terms, no x to the third, so we have 4x to the third. And you have negative 8x squared minus 8x squared gives you minus 16x squared. 3x plus 16x gives you 19x. And we bring down to minus 6. So after your distributions are done and you combine like terms, you end up with 4x to the third minus 16x squared plus 19x minus 6. Okay, now here what we are doing is we're squaring a binomial. Now, anytime you square a binomial, there is a shortcut, but I'd rather have you guys take this binomial you're squaring and write it out. When we square something, it's the base times itself, the number of times the exponent tells you to. So in this case, we're just going to do 8x plus 5 times 8x plus 5. And then we can go ahead and FOIL or do our distributions. I'd like to see us get in the habit of, doing it quickly by going 8x times 8x is 64x squared. 8x times 5 is 40x. 5 times 8x is 40x. And then 5 times 5 is 25. Now, the only like terms we have here are the two middle terms. So we get 64x squared plus 80x plus 25. And this is what we get when we square the binomial. Now, it is very, 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 very important to know that you don't just square the first term and square the second term. You have to go ahead and FOIL it out, or the shortcut is you square the first term, square the last term, but when you multiply these together, you get 40x, and then if we double that, that would give you your middle term. Alright, but that middle term is important, so you cannot forget about it. Okay. Now, this problem here is called a sum and difference. And the reason is both first terms are the same, and the last terms are the same, but the signs are different. Now, what happens when we multiply these out? Well, this doesn't happen all the time, Excuse me, the screen's going nuts here. But when we have a sum and difference, when we go ahead and multiply 9x times 9x, 81x to the second, 9x times negative 4, negative 36x, 4 times 9x is plus 36x, 4 times negative 4 is negative 16. But when you go to, combine the two middle terms, these eliminate. So you end up with 81x squared minus 16. And this comes back to us when we get into factoring, what they call a difference of two squares. Okay, so it is important. But if you don't know, if you know a shortcut in terms of if you know the first and last term are the same, but one's addition, one's subtraction, you can get away with just doing the first and last terms. But don't use a shortcut if you don't know it. Now, area of a rectangle. Any rectangle I have, if I, have this rectangle and I have the length and the width, whatever you want to, width and length, it doesn't matter. Okay, when you go to find the area, that you should know that the area of a rectangle is length times width. So if I'm looking for the area, the amount of space that this rectangle takes up, right? If I look at the side lengths, this being the width and this being the length, what happens is you multiply those together. So the area would be 7x plus 5 times 3x plus 2. And this ends up just being a foiling problem. 7x times 3x, 21x squared. 7x times 2, 14x. 5 times 3x is 15x. 5 times 2 is 10. And when you go ahead and combine like terms, 21x squared, combine these two middle terms to get 29x plus 10. So, in the adding and subtracting video, you went ahead and you found the perimeter of the rectangle. In this case, we're finding the area. No, perimeter is when you add up all four sides. The area is when you multiply the sides. Thank you very much for your time, and please make sure you go and do the U-try problems on your own.